aí, ao vivo.
Olá, pessoal. Boa tarde. Retomamos agora a nossa segunda atividade aí da abertura do nosso 9º Seminário Internacional do INCT-InEAC, com a conferência de abertura ministrada pelo professor Jorge Bisharat. Vamos explicar mais ou menos como vai ser a dinâmica. A gente vai apresentar brevemente o currículo do professor Jorge, depois a gente vai exibir a conferência dele, que já está gravada, legendada em português, para que todo mundo possa acompanhar. E assim que encerrar a conferência gravada e legendada do professor Jorge, ele vai entrar ao vivo aqui com a gente e nós vamos comentar, responder possíveis perguntas que surjam aí no chat. Eu e Kant vamos fazendo aqui uma tradução livre, não necessariamente simultânea, né, mas que permita a compreensão e a comunicação entre todos nós aqui. Então, fiquem à vontade para, após a conferência, fazerem comentários ou perguntas para o professor Jorge, que ele vai estar aqui com a gente para responder. Passo a palavra agora para o professor Kant para apresentar um pouco quem é o Jorge aqui no nosso instituto, né, e sobre o que será a conferência.
Certo. Bom, o professor Jorge Bisharat é Professor of Law, quer dizer que ele é o professor titular, né, de Direito de um college, que é o mais antigo lá da Califórnia, e que é uma faculdade de Direito, né, que chamava-se Hastings. Ele vai, inclusive, fazer alguma referência a essa mudança desse nome, que tem a ver com essa conferência de hoje, por isso que eu estou dizendo. E ele acabou, numa ocasião próxima, me disse que saiu uma lei lá na Califórnia exatamente mudando, né, o nome e ele vai explicar por quê. Vocês esperem aí que vai aparecer. O professor Jorge, ele é doutor em antropologia, né? Ele é meu colega lá de Harvard e também é formado em Direito pela Harvard University, né? Ele, inclusive, fez os 2 cursos juntos, o que já diz mais ou menos o tamanho, né, do problema. E depois ele veio para São Francisco e foi defensor público em São Francisco durante algum tempo. Nessa ocasião, em 1990, eu estive em São Francisco com ele, fazendo pesquisa de campo com a Defensoria Pública e com o Sistema de Justiça Criminal. E depois ele se dedicou exclusivamente ao ensino, né, no Hastings College of Law, né, que era como chamava antes esse college, que pertence à Universidade da Califórnia, em São Francisco, né? E o professor Jorge é consultor internacional, né, do INEAC e nos acompanha já há bastante tempo, tem vindo aqui ao Brasil presencialmente, dessa vez não veio por causa dessa confusão aí pandêmica, e nos auxilia muito, né, já fez várias intervenções aqui, publicou artigos na Dilemas, publicou artigos na Antropolítica, publicou um artigo muito interessante em português, traduzido em português, no livro que a professora Fernanda, o professor Rafael Iório e eu fizemos sobre o sistema de justiça dos Estados Unidos e do Brasil, sobre a plea bargain, né? Então, é uma pessoa, é um antropólogo e jurista, né? Como eu mesmo, né? E por isso nós temos bastante afinidade com o trabalho do Jorge e ele com o nosso trabalho, né? Ele nos prestigia muito, gosta muito de vir aqui e é uma pessoa muito simpática. Além disso, o professor Jorge é uma revelação do blues, né? Ele é um cantor, né, e toca gaita de boca e tem várias músicas, inclusive algumas dedicadas aqui ao Brasil. Tem uma sobre Itaipu, né? Tem outra com o negócio do cara que lavava o cavalo com champanhe, né? Lá no Amazonas, que ele ficou sabendo da história. O cara rico lá lavava o cavalo com champanhe. E também tem 2 que ele mandou esses dias aí, né? Uma sobre o negacionismo, né? Tal, da fake news, né? E uma outra, agora não. Qual era a outra que ele mandou? Ele mandou também outra. Então, ele é uma pessoa muito versátil, né? E um intelectual muito competente, e nós vamos, então, assisti-lo nessa conferência que ele vai fazer, que, inclusive, ele nos convidou, né, para fazer parte, a minha Paloma e a professora Eliane Cantarino, para fazer parte de um projeto que seria um desdobramento dessa conferência que ele vai fazer hoje sobre esse negócio da violência, né, da colonização, de povoamento né, que ele vai falar da Califórnia e da Palestina, e ele está pensando também em fazer alguma coisa sobre a Amazônia, né? Isso depois a gente pode conversar. Então, por favor, Breno, você... Bom, agradecer, né, a equipe técnica aí e, por favor, liga no Jorge aí.
Hello, friends. It's always a pleasure to be back presenting at INEAC, my intellectual home away from home. Wish I could be there with you in person. This is just going to have to do for the time being. I'm going to be speaking to you today about research that I've been doing over the last year or so on the topic of private violence in the settler colonial state. By that, I mean threats or actual application of physical violence. So I'm not talking about just metaphorical or discursive violence. I mean the real thing. And I'm focusing on actors other than state officials, private individuals, in other words, not the army, not the police, not any other state officials. And then in the context of settler colonialism. Settler colonialism is a specific form of colonialism involving the substantial displacement of indigenous peoples in favor of settlers from elsewhere. Of course, not all colonial societies were like that. There were some in which the metropole, the colonial metropole, only sent a few people, controlled a few strategic assets or ports, without really doing much to displace the indigenous population. And in others, that displacement was substantial. Those are what we would call settler colonial experiences. Now, even within that, I'm not interested in any private violence. I'm not concerned, for example, with violence between settlers, domestic violence, a murder. No, what I'm looking at specifically is violence by settlers against the indigenous population. And generally that violence has led either to mass killings, what we often think of as genocide today, or forced displacement, or some combination of the two. In a number of cases, displacement, while not necessarily involving mass killings in the first place, have forced indigenous people into marginal areas where they are unable to sustain themselves. They can't farm, they can't hunt, they can't fish, and therefore they starve. So displacement may be a step in the direction, if not of mass killings, at least of mass deaths. Now, my working hypothesis is that this kind of private violence is not merely an incident of settler colonialism, something that just happens at the distant geographic frontier out of the sight of the state and where state authority is weak. Rather, I argue that private violence in settler colonial states is actually integral to those states and serves systemic functions. Now, private violence in the service of colonialism has an old historical lineage. It may date back as far as the institution of privateering in the late 16th century. You may recall Sir Francis Drake and others who were deputized, in a sense, by the state to prosecute their wars against other colonial powers. In the case of the British, it was primarily at that time against the Spanish. Now, I am not the first person to to fix on, to identify this possibly systemic relationship between private violence in the settler colonial state. So the Australian anthropologist Patrick Wolfe spoke about it, although he was actually, while Australian himself, he was talking about the United States. Other Australians have essentially recognized this same relationship in the settlement of Australia itself. There is a South African professor by the name of Muhammad Dhikri, who has done a work on the role, he calls it civilian-driven violence in settler colonial genocide. So he's focusing on something a little bit different and more specific in some senses. So, there is a certain amount of literature out there that recognizes this relationship that I'm focusing on. What I am adding to it is or maybe a couple of things. First, that this role of private violence is also true in Palestine today. And then secondly, that it may also be true of most, if not all, settler colonial projects. That's something, of course, yet to be researched and argued. But I have a feeling, my instinct tells me that this phenomenon is possibly quite typical of settler colonial projects. Now, my own work, and I am enlisting other scholars in this work on private violence, including some of you. My own work is mainly focused on Palestine. And one of the reasons for that focus, aside from the fact that I've been focusing on it for many years, is that we have the opportunity to observe settler colonialism unfolding in real time. Now, we're not that's not the only site in the world where that is occurring, and there are places within Brazil itself where perhaps this process is unfolding in the Amazon regions and the like. But the ultimate ambition of the research, in collaboration with other scholars, is to expand the scope of the work, both spatially and historically. Now, this is, I should be very clear that I make no assumption that the role of private violence is uniform across time and space. It may not be. That remains to be seen. There may be similarities and differences from place to place and from time to time. And I'm shortly going to get to two examples where I think that that principle is in play. I also recognize that violence is not the only form of private intervention in support of colonial efforts. And there is a kinship, there's perhaps a continuum of things that private actors can do in support of settler colonial projects. And they include, for example, in contemporary Palestine, the financing of settler projects. So a number of the settlements and the settlement efforts, let's say, that went on in Jerusalem, and some of you may have seen the resistance and the oppression, all focused on struggles over housing in Jerusalem, in which entities and individuals within the United States actually have been funding the settler efforts. And so there is that aspect of financing. There is also, we now are seeing in relation to Palestine, the phenomenon of lawfare, that is to say, the mobilization of law and legal means, courts, lawsuits, and the like, to further and to defend settler colonial interests. And there are a number of Israeli NGOs that are conducting this kind of lawfare. And then I even see a relationship myself, to Israel's, what I would call a troll army. That is to say, there are private individuals who have made it their purpose, and not. I mean, there is evidence that this is coordinated directly with the state, to harass critics of Israel on social media. So, these are all different variants of private participation in the advancement of a settler colonial project. So let me let my dog out. And sorry for that. And then start with two vignettes or two stories. The first occurred in 1982. I was between my second and third years of law school. And I received funding from my law school to do a student summer internship with an organization in the West Bank that was at that time called Al-Qanun min Ajl al-Insan, which means law in the service of humanity. That was the very first human rights organization established in the West Bank in the mid to late 70s, it has since changed its name to Al-Haq. And those of you who follow the news of Palestine closely will recognize that as one of 6 Palestinian civil society organizations that the Israeli government has charged with being criminal terrorist organizations, and has attempted to shut them down. And it's caused a great deal of controversy since that was first announced. That designation of them of these groups as terrorist organizations was announced last year in October. So my part of my assignment there with Al-Haq, or Al-Qanun min Ajl al-Insan, was to investigate and document allegations of settler violence. So I toured around the West Bank, often accompanied by another researcher or a colleague from the organization. I'll just continue to call it Al-Haq since that's the new name. And I toured around the West Bank, and I spoke with Palestinians who had suffered various kinds of harms, violent harms usually, at the hands of Israeli settlers. Now, one day we had gone to the village of Silwad, that is outside of Ramallah. Ramallah has, in recent years, become the administrative capital of the West Bank, of the Palestinian Authority. Then it was a kind of medium-sized town. And Silwad was this village to the northeast of Ramallah, just maybe 6 or 8, 10 miles. I don't remember exactly. So we were sitting on a rock wall around an olive grove. Me and a man I will call Abu Munif. That was not his real name, but that's what I call him. And a coworker, one of my coworkers. And Abu Munif was telling us that several weeks before, he and his son had gone out to their olive grove to tend the grove, and they found that that 20 or so of their trees, of their olive trees, which are very precious, they're kind of the lifeblood of agriculture in that part of the West Bank, at least that part of Palestine. 20 of their trees had been cut down, and then a similar number of grapevines had also been sawn down. And they didn't know who had done it, but they presumed that it had been settlers from the settlement called Afra, which was nearby. Now, Afra was a settlement that had been established not through any official act by the Israeli state or the Israeli military government. It was an abandoned Jordanian army post, and it had been taken over spontaneously by a group of religious nationalist Israeli settlers. And they had simply gone to the place, set up shop, and started to, build a settlement. Soon after this happened, one day after the trees were cut down, Abu Munif and his son heard a bulldozer approaching their orchard. So they ran out there, and it appeared that the bulldozer was going to plow through their orchard in the area where the trees had been cut. So it became apparent to them that this bulldozer was going to be used to create a new access road to the settlement of Afra. And of course, Abu Munif and his son, who would be Munif, Abu means father of, Munif would be the son's name. So Munif and Abu Munif tried to stop the settlers, and both of them were beaten moderately severely. They weren't, they didn't suffer any broken limbs as far as I can recall, but, they were beaten up and bloodied. And by the time we got there, which was now several weeks after this attack by the settlers, this physical attack on Abu Munif and Munif, Abu Munif, dangled this document in front of us, and we took a look at it. And what it was an order of expropriation of his property issued by the Israeli military government. So what had happened was that this settlement that was initiated illegally, even under Israeli law, had been retroactively legalized by the Israeli military government. Now, there are approximately somewhere around 270 Israeli settlements in the West Bank now. And slightly more than half of them were established in exactly this same manner. In other words, not by any formal action by the state to begin with, but rather by private action, often involving violence. And later, not all of them yet have been retroactively legalized, but many of them have been. So that's the first vignette, and I'll just leave it at there for now. The next vignette occurred here in California in the mid-19th century. And this may be familiar because I shared some of these facts with you several years ago, I believe in 2019 when I spoke at UFE. Let me just say that the information that I'm sharing with you here is primarily based on historical research by the historian Professor Brendan Lindsay, who teaches at Sacramento State University here in California, about 90 miles up the road from me. So, and this involved Seranus Hastings, the namesake of my law school. That is the person for whom my law school was named. I should please don't let me forget to tell you about the story of the naming of the school, because the governor of the state of California has just last Friday signed an order to change the name of the school in light of the facts that I'm about to share with you. But that's a digression, and if you're curious, let's talk about it later. So Seranus Hastings had come from the state of Iowa. He had been a Supreme Court justice in the state of Iowa. He had served in the federal government in the House of Representatives as a representative from Iowa. And he was a lawyer, obviously, very accomplished man, obviously, an eminent person, highly educated. He came to California during the period of the gold rush, which gold was discovered in California in 1848, and the gold rush mostly occurred. I mean, it kind of triggered the gold rush that occurred mostly in 1849. You know, that is why our local football team is referred to as the 49ers. So this is a very kind of central part of California state history. So he came to California in the gold rush, but he wasn't one to go out and go into a mine and pick at the wall and try to discover a vein of gold ore, nor was he going to go out and into the rivers and pan for gold as other people were doing. Instead, he did what the smart people did at the time, which was the phrase that people say is he mined the miners. In other words, he made money off of the miners. And that's how a lot of the wealth of the major families here in California and the major financial institutions were built. This is the Bank of America, Wells Fargo. Those major banks all started during this gold rush period, and by providing those services to the miners. The miners, as a rule, didn't get rich themselves, but they sure made a lot of other people rich, or some other people rich. Anyway, so soon after, actually, his trajectory, that is Hastings' trajectory, was not so much in banking or anything like that. First, he came out here, and he was appointed to be the first Supreme Court Justice of the state of California. And to date, he's the only person who's ever served as the Supreme Court Justice of two different states, Iowa and California. He didn't serve for very long in the Supreme Court. He later ran for and was elected Attorney General of the state of California. He didn't do that for very long. He left, he went into private legal practice, and he also started land speculating. In other words, he would purchase land, sometimes ranch it or farm it for a period of time, and then sell it at a profit, and then buy more, and just keep going like that. And by doing that repeatedly over a period of years, he became one of the wealthiest people in the state in the early history of the state. Now, what he also did was to help to organize and to fund a private militia that went to lands north of San Francisco in Mendocino County to an area called the Eden Valley, and to essentially have them displace the 600 or so members of the Yuki Indian nation who were living in the valley at that time. And this was done by absolutely brutal violence. The details are gory and awful, and they're all now a part of the public record. The Indians were either, the Yuki nation members were either killed or driven into a reservation, really a concentration camp, you would call it in modern terms, in an adjacent valley, in the Round Valley, it's called. And they were consolidated with 6 or 7 other, I think 6 other Indian tribes who were similarly concentrated into this one little place. And it happened that, in the pre-settlement period, the Yukis and these other people were actually all enemies, or at least they were enemies of the Yuki. So this was a pretty sad, pretty tragic story. Now the question is there anything linking these two vignettes? Any common threads that connect them despite their distance in time and place? I believe so. let me start with similarities. I will get to differences because there are important differences as well, but let me start with the similarities. So first, from the broadest and most obvious, both vignettes unfold in a broader context of settler colonialism. And again, I will say that this is a form of colonialism involving the violent displacement of indigenous settlers in significant numbers. Now, perhaps I didn't use the term violent when I first defined what I was talking about. But, as you probably all know, Native people never just give up their land willingly. And so violence is always an accompaniment and a tool of settler colonialism. Now, California, as you may know, was settled before Anglo settlement. There was Spanish, and then the Spanish settlement and Spanish colonialism, followed by a brief period after Mexico became independent from Spain, followed by a Mexican administration in the 1820s to 1840s, late until California became a state in 1848. So it is true that phase of colonialism in California was not really settler colonialism. Instead, Native labor, particularly as managed through a system of Franciscan missions, Catholic missions, Native labor was vital to the economy, and Indians were of all different tribes in California, up and down. Well, the settlement came from the south, from Mexico, and extended all the way up the coast of California as far as Sonoma, which is a little bit north of here, not too much. Mostly confined to the coastal region. There wasn't much settlement away from the coast, and it didn't go all the way north to the northern border of the state either. This shifted, this reliance on Native labor shifted with the gold rush, when there was a vast influx of white labor. And so it goes to show you that the types of settler colonialism are not pure. And they can shift, right? One that started off not being settler colonial, an example of settler colonialism, morphed into one with white settlement into the state. And even with white settlement, there was a certain amount of continued enslavement of Native Americans, of Native Californians. Interestingly, California entered the Union, entered the United States just as we were heading toward the Civil War over slavery, largely over slavery, and it entered nominally as a free state, not as a slave state, and so how it managed to maintain slavery is kind of an interesting side story. But again, I want to avoid that digression and stick to our topic of today. So by the 1850s, California was clearly headed in the direction of a settler colonial model. And from 1846, just before California became a state, to 1880, the Native population of the state was reduced from around 150,000 to 16,000. So almost a 90% reduction of the Native population of the state. Meanwhile, Zionist colonization in Palestine, it began in 1882. That was the very first Zionist settlement in the area of what is now Tel Aviv. Zionist colonization from the outset was explicitly aiming to replace the Palestinian population. And it was exemplified in the early Zionist practice of what was referred to as Hebrew labor. In other words, Zionists would, if they gained their foothold on some land, would employ only Jewish or Hebrew labor on that land, and did their best to make sure that Zionist enterprise wasn't of benefit to the local population. Again, not a clear. I mean, that was only a tendency. It didn't happen in all settlements. There were places where Palestinians were employed, et cetera, et cetera. And over time, it has proved true that there are times when Israel has relied on Palestinian labor, but the main outcome of the drive to replace the Palestinian population was what Palestinians refer to as the Nakba. Nakba means, it's an Arabic word that means disaster or catastrophe. And that is how Palestinians refer to the process of forced displacement that took a big step forward in the 1948 war, when nearly 3/4 of the Palestinian population, somewhere around 750,000 people, were driven out by force. And there were massacres, there was a lot of violence, and the population was basically ethnically cleansed. This has, this commitment to replacement of the Palestinian population has been expressed further in continuing policies to encourage Palestinian exodus. I could give you many examples. Ask me in discussion if you're curious. It has led to containment in reservations or reservation-like enclaves such as the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip, the population of the Gaza Strip today is around 2 million people. Roughly 65 to 70% of those people are all refugees who were driven into the Gaza Strip in 1948 and after 1948. So that, I mean, very reminiscent of, the Round Valley place where Indian tribes in California were concentrated. Now, another commonality, another similarity is that neither vignette that I shared with you, neither of the two vignettes were unique. Instead, they were emblematic or representative of broad, and in the case of Palestine, continuing trends. So what Sir Ernest Hastings did here in California was what a lot of other people were doing. And that is why Hastings, of course, wasn't responsible for, reducing the population of Native Americans Native Californians from, 200,000 to 16 in a number of years. He didn't do that all by himself. He had a lot of help. There were a lot of people who were doing the same thing up and down the state, the entire state. So again, representative or emblematic, not unique. Same in Palestine. A third similarity: the violence in both cases, I think, shares two purposes, dual purposes. First, land seizures, and secondly, repression of Native resistance in whatever form it came. And that includes here in California, there were killings or thefts of livestock. That was how, for example, with Hastings, Native Americans, Native Californians, possibly Yuki, I don't know. I don't know that anybody knows, killed one of his prize stallions, his horses that he had been keeping on the land. this was a form of resistance. It was also a form of survival because, the deer had been driven off. The landscape was being transformed. The pigs, hogs brought by Serranus and his men were eating up all the acorns, which was a staple of the Native American diet. So it was both retaliatory in a sense and a survival technique. A fourth similarity is in both cases the surrounding ideology of racism. That is the idea of the positive virtues or the entitlements of one group, the settlers, over another group, which bears negative traits. So, and frequently the image of the indigenous people in the settler population is that these people were violent savages by their nature or by their culture. In other words, their violence against the settlers was not a consequence of what the settlers had done to these people. It was rather inherent in their nature, and the settlers were different and superior people in a variety of ways. Now, the content of the racist ideology of settler colonists, isn't the same in all places. It has its distinctive flavors. In Palestine, there was at least among religious nationalists, and that's of course only part of the Zionist movement, but the religious nationalists, believe in the divine entitlement, their divine entitlement to the land and to ancient title. God gave us this land. We are the chosen people. That's for the religiously inclined, and that's different. That's not the same as as here in California. But the notion of that we are a civilization entitled to this land, more so than whoever was there before, if they even recognize the existence of other people being there in any way, we are more entitled. And this makes sense because it is very hard to sustain a violent campaign against another people without some ideological justification. You can't, as one of Hastings' men did, cleave open the skull of an 11-year-old Yuki girl without having some notion that she is not of your kind, that she is not a human in the same way or at the same level as you. There's just no other way to rationalize that kind of violence, that kind of brutal violence against another person. And racism is the glue that holds settler society together and that propels it forward toward the displacement of natives with a sense of moral purpose, not guilt, no, of triumph, of the idea that we're doing right. Now, another similarity is that in both cases, there was extreme official violence too. So, yes, there was native resistance, but it was vastly disproportionate to the numbers of casualties among the, on the native side. In other words, yes, in California, people fought back, but the scale of violence that was used against them was vastly greater than what they were capable of using against settlers. So, for example, the U.S. cavalry or the U.S. Army, I don't remember what particular units of the Army, but the U.S. Army committed a slaughter of Indians near Clear Lake. That's north of here, not very far, and suffered virtually no casualties themselves and wiped out, possibly 200 people, almost an entire village. They were on an island in this lake. The Army went out to the island on boats and things, decimated the entire group. And of course, we just saw we've seen this recurrently in the Gaza Strip. Just a few weeks ago, Israel launched attacks against the West Bank, killing 49 Palestinians. How many Israeli casualties? None. So that kind of disparity in the scale of violence is another similarity. It partly reflects the arms disparity. The simple, military technology on the one side is very high. It is great, and on the other side is almost non-existent. But keep in mind that just because you, as the settler, group, have superior arms, that does not mean that you have to use them. There was a deliberate policy in both places of what Benjamin Madley is a historian at UCLA, University of California in Los Angeles, historian of California, has written a book called American Genocide, and it's all about this period of California history when genocide, he argues, in the legal sense, occurred against Native Americans. He referred to pedagogic killings. In other words, the killings were for the purpose of teaching the natives a lesson. That is, if you kill my stallion, or kill a cow, or kill one of us, we're gonna wipe you out. This stems from and is connected with an idea that Native peoples, and this is part of the racism, right? Native people only understand the language of force. Right? You can't reason with them. They're not reasonable people. They're inherently, violent, and so the killings were categorical and collective. So when the militia, Hastings militia, went out after a cow had been killed or the stallion had been killed, they didn't even bother to try to hunt down the specific individuals who they suspected of committing what they called the depredation, right? They just went to a village and wiped everybody out. They killed everybody, burned their food and other supplies and their homes and everything. So this was different, completely different from the way people here in California responded when white rustlers, in maybe from if you've watched U.S. westerns back from the old days, rustling is stealing livestock, right? And white people did it too, right? White people would come and steal people's livestock from their property. This isn't the way they didn't go wipe out a village of white people when white rustlers stole property, stole cows. So again, this is the kind of it doesn't matter. This is like a categorical battle between us and the native population. And so collective punishment was the norm. Now, there are similarities in Israeli behavior toward the Palestinians. I'm going to just give you one example for now. In the 2006 war, Israel's attack on Lebanon and its fight with the group Hezbollah, they enunciated what they called, that is, the Israelis called the Dahya doctrine. Dahya was a neighborhood in Beirut, Lebanon, where there was a predominantly Shia Muslim population. Shia Muslims are the ones primarily who are involved in the group Hezbollah. So they flattened Dahya, that is, they bombed it and flattened it, and made a military doctrine out of the principle of, you fire rockets into Israel, we're going to flatten your neighborhoods. And it's not like it wasn't where Hezbollah had fired from. They weren't trying to attack military actors. Civilians, everybody, the entire neighborhood bombed. And there are many other examples over time and in different places. This has been a sort of a long-standing principle of Israeli military doctrine. Now, another, I think I need, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. There are other similarities I wish I could draw out for you, but they're really not as key as a couple. And then I want to make sure that I have time to talk about some differences. So here's another similarity that's very important. Both settler colonial projects are self-imagined liberal democracies with some level of commitment to the rule of law. Now, this may not be true of plenty of other settler colonial projects, but it was of these two, or the two involved in these vignettes. And in neither case was outright slaughter of natives ever legally permissible. There have always been, in each place, in California and in Israel, forces of and voices of conscience and restraint. And even in to some degree, solidarity with the indigenous community. And, you have the phenomenon today, for example, of Israeli peace activists who go and stand between Palestinian villagers and Israeli settlers who are trying to take over their property, their land, whatever. And sometimes themselves are beaten and attacked and arrested and the like. So, it's not like either place was characterized only by these terrible racist settlers. There have always been, like I said, voices of restraint, voices of concern over the legality of how these things were being carried out, or illegality, as the case may be. Now, because of this is another similarity. Because of this commitment to the rule of law, there have always had to be legal loopholes. So, as I said, in California, it was never legal to simply murder natives. However, natives could not be lawyers or jurors until 1873, after their numbers had been quite reduced, and a white person could not be convicted on the basis of native testimony, right? So, who's going to testify against the foreman and the leader of Hastings militia? Certainly not his other militia members, and who are all equally implicated, and not the Indians, and therefore nobody, right? So, like I said, not legal to murder natives, but no way to do anything really effectively about it legally. In the occupied territories in Palestine, it's different in the sense that is the way that the legal loopholes are established is different, but the effect is the same. And the way it works in the occupied territories in particular is through the establishment of entirely different legal systems for Palestinians and for Israelis. Israelis go to a civil court system. Palestinians are tried in military courts. Conviction rate is above 99%. It's like 99.74%. So, and no procedural safeguards, military laws governing the criminal procedure, which are highly unfair. And so that's how, Israeli settlers are protected from legal consequence, and Palestinians are the ones who suffer the legal consequences. Now let me finally turn to some differences and then wrap up. Now, I think, clearly here in the state of California, you could characterize what occurred as genocide. And as I told you, Benjamin Madley argued that that was true, not only in the lay sense of mass killings, but actually in the legal sense of the, a system designed to eliminate a group as such. That has not been true in Palestine. We did have ethnic cleansing. We had two major paroxysms of violence in 1948 that expelled, as I said, 750,000 Palestinians. In 1967, again, around 250,000 Palestinians were expelled. But we haven't had mass killings. Now, I think an argument could be made that genocide in the narrow legal sense maybe is going on, but let's leave that alone. I don't think it's that compelling. I think they're just different. In Palestine, unlike in California, the settler society has been confronted and met by a rival national movement. Here in California, there were dozens at least of tribes, and those tribes were not organized politically and unified politically. There were more like bands and groups of Indians that were they would live together, and they had their own systems of government and courts, in informal courts and the like, but they were not a unified group. And certainly, I think if I were a settler, confronting a conscious national movement as my opponent on the other side would be a different thing than facing relatively disorganized or not unified Native Californians. Of course, what happened in California unfolded in the 19th century, and what is going on we're talking about a contemporary example in Palestine. And the implications of that are quite significant. We've got a totally transformed ideological setting, especially after World War II. So we experienced the several decades in the 20th century, second half of the 20th century of decolonization. I guess starting in 47 with India's freedom from British colonialism and extending through the Portuguese colonies and others. We're operating in a new legal environment with the concept of genocide, which was really conceived and then brought into legal form after World War II and after World War II. We had beginning in the last quarter of the 20th century of the rise of human rights organizations and NGOs, non-governmental organizations. We have now, as of 2000 or so, the institution of the International Criminal Court. And of course, we also have news and now social media. So, what happens, all of this means that what happens in Palestine is highly visible, whereas what happened in California a long time ago was barely visible, let's say. It was visible, and newspapers wrote about these things that went on, these killings, and in some cases decried it, in other cases encouraged it, but it was somewhat known what was going on, but nothing like and certainly not the visual aspect, the horror of seeing somebody beaten and or shot and killed, whatever. Didn't see that in 1858. Today we do. And the upshot is that Israeli settler colonialism is unfolding under intense scrutiny, unlike that of earlier settler colonial projects. And this imposes constraints on what Israel can do, and necessarily forces it into less violent and more bureaucratic form. which may, in fact, have the effect of elevating the utility of private violence to the settler colonial project. Now let me conclude with a few observations about what role I think private violence has played historically and is perhaps playing in contemporary Palestine. So first of all, there is a quantitative dimension. So, I noted for you earlier that the number of settlements has been doubled by private settlement actions. We had, roughly half, actually a little fewer than half, established by actions of the state, and the rest of them by actions of private settlers. Secondly, the other sort of quantitative dimension, and this was cited actually by Israeli police officials back in May of 2021, when there was a significant uprising over what was going on in Sheikh Jarrah, that neighborhood of Jerusalem, and then there was the fighting in Gaza, and clashes broke out within Israel itself, and there were Israeli vigilantes who organized themselves on social media, on WhatsApp and other such apps, and went and attacked, Palestinian citizens of Israel. And the Israeli police official referred to them as force multipliers. In other words, they enhanced the repressive capacity of the state with their additional violence. Now, overall, there may also be a qualitative dimension to private violence as opposed to state violence. It is perhaps, I'm not as certain of this, as confident of this, but, there is often a greater horror to private violence. It can erupt at any time. It is unpredictable. It can be used within Israel in addition to the occupied territories. Overall, though, private violence expands the scope of opportunities to use violence in the service of the settler colonial project, while providing deniability to the liberal democratic state that doesn't want to accept responsibility for a certain quantum of violence. From the state's perspective, it's also cheap, as settlers are motivated and paid by the spoils of their violence. You don't have to hire an army if you have a bunch of settlers who are motivated to go out and grab land and keep it for themselves. Now, does all of this merely state the obvious? Possibly. But I think the frequency of private violence in settler colonial projects through time and across space strengthens the inference that it's not accidental. It makes it more possible to identify official tolerance of private violence as a deliberate policy of a settler colonial project. It diminishes the space for deniability, and therefore, I hope, strengthens our hand in stopping it in real time. Thank you so much for listening. I look forward to your questions.
Olá, todo mundo. Bom, como então conversamos, né? O George está aqui ao vivo para responder perguntas e comentários, então convido aí a todos os nossos ouvintes a se manifestarem, se desejarem, né? Breno, pode colocar o pessoal de Libras já aí. Isso, obrigada. Aí pode botar no quadradinho pequenininho. Hi, George. We are very happy to have you here and to have you talking in our opening event. It's always a pleasure to have you here with us. You have been working hard for us because in the last week we have already another talk with subtitles. So if everyone here wants to see it, it's available on our YouTube channel. So, George, we are doing this kind of dynamic. Kanti will talk with you in English, and then we wait a little time so I can translate in Portuguese for our audience who doesn't speak in English, and for our sign language to translate it. So I will pass the word for you, and then I will translate what you have to say. And then Kanti want to make some comments and questions about the conference. Sure.
Yeah,
Sure.
Thank you, George.
Thank you.
Should I?
No, George, do you want to introduce yourself or say something before Kanti make the comments?
I've already introduced you at the beginning. You were not here, but I introduced you in Portuguese, of course. But if you want to say something in complement to the talk or to anything, just.
No, I will only say thank you for the invitation, and thank you, Wellington, for the translation. I know that was a lot of work, and it's always fun and a pleasure to be with all of you. And after listening to me for a full hour, I think it's time for me to hear your questions.
Ok.
Deixa eu então falar um pouquinho em português o que o George falou. Então, o George agradeceu o convite, a presença dele aqui também ao vivo para poder comentar e responder as perguntas. Kanti vai fazer alguns comentários e algumas perguntas também sobre a conferência em inglês. Assim que ele terminar, eu também vou fazer essa tradução livre, e aí a gente passa a palavra para o George responder e, de novo, eu faço a tradução. Tá bom, pessoal?
Ok, ele também agradeceu o Wellington.
O Wellington, nosso colega recém-chegado ao INEAC, mestrando do PPG-JS, que realizou esse belíssimo trabalho de tradução e de inserir as legendas em português nos 2 vídeos, nas 2 conferências que o George generosamente fez para nós, e um trabalho realmente muito bem feito, e o George agradeceu a ele.
Well, I'll do some comments, and then after that, I will put 2 questions for you. Sure. Okay. So the comments are, it's very impressive about the racism that they talk about, the native race against natives. And I remember that the Pope here in Brazil, to allow the work of missionaries, especially Jesuits and in missions, the Pope has to make a statement that they were humans and they have souls. Yes. That of course didn't stop the slavery, and didn't stop, but it started the catechization. I mean, it started it was very interesting because they became subject to the slavery, and also from the I don't know if catechese is in English.
It's make them Christians.
And this reminds me of the difficulty that in Brazil you have to understand, especially the enforcement agencies, the difficulty they have of thinking in human rights, because our legal history has a lot of problems with civil rights. And the idea that, all the citizens have a minimum of common rights before the state. And here, one of the problems we have, to discuss with this kind of people from public safety is that, if they think that if there are rights of their rights, so the bandits, the criminals cannot have the same rights. They have other rights or they have no rights, but not the same rights as the enforcement agencies people have, which is and they usually refer to this, criminals, dealers, drug dealers, as barbarians and things like that.
Yeah.
There are this adjective, contemporaneous idea that these people are not humans, you see?
Right.
So this remains, the language of this kind of conflict between order and criminality and whatever.
Sure.
And this idea also that they only understand the language of force, of violence.
Right.
The other thing is that I thought was very interesting, the idea that the white people could not be convicted by native testimony. And that's the idea, because I know that the United States, the civil rights enter the word of citizenship through the jury trial, the jury bench.
Right.
And the idea that if you are a juror, then the category you are going to examine, you are going to convict or not, are people equal to you. So,
right.
They started with only white men, Protestants, and after that, women, and then after that, Catholic and Jews, and whatever, as all these minorities entering the jury. So, again, it's an idea of civil rights. I mean, the indigenous people, the native people, did not have civil rights.
Yeah.
And so, what you describe about this 19th century California is very similar to what happened here with our Indians. Also, it's the similarity, and the way it happened also was very similar.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe here there was, I don't know if you have it so much in California, but maybe here there were more slavery of Indians, a lot of slavery here before the African slavery and during also the African slavery, but before the African slavery.
Right.
Many Indians were, and you want to translate to people?
Eu fiquei pensando, não é melhor você?
Ok. Bom, o que eu disse é que havia esse racismo, né, que ele diz que houve contra os índios da Califórnia, também teve aqui no Brasil, e inclusive, né, me lembrei que o Papa, né, teve que fazer uma bula dizendo que os índios tinham algo para poder catequizar eles, né? Então, eles eram escravizados pelos bandeirantes e eram catequizados em missões, né? Eram guardados em missões pelos jesuítas, né? E que isso decorre de uma ideia de direitos humanos, né? Que permanece até hoje, inclusive nas nossas forças policiais, etc. Né? A ideia de que, se os policiais têm certos direitos, os criminosos não podem ter os mesmos direitos de nenhum, os bandidos, né? Como eles dizem, né? Então, essa ideia, né, de direitos civis também perpassou, né, os Estados Unidos com relação, né, à ausência de direitos civis com relação aos nativos da Califórnia, que é o que ele está descrevendo, né? Inclusive, quando ele diz que só em 1873 é que os índios puderam ser jurados, né, que aí já tinham sido exterminados, né, essa coisa que ele falou, eram 200 mil, ficaram 16 mil, corresponde à ideia de cidadania, né, nos Estados Unidos, que é exatamente quando a minoria ocupa o banco dos jurados, né? Então, toda a história do júri americano se refere a isso, né, que só jurados só podiam ser os protestantes, depois os católicos, homens protestantes, homens católicos, homens judeus, depois as mulheres, depois aí vieram as outras minorias, né, os negros, etc., paulatinamente se constituindo em pessoas a serem julgadas pelos seus pares, que eram os negros, as mulheres, né, etc., etc., etc. Enquanto isso não havia, eles eram julgados pelos outros. Então, essas, entre aspas, minorias que eram julgadas e não tinham representatividade no banco dos jurados, é porque elas não tinham cidadania, né? Eles não tinham direito aos direitos civis, né? A cidadania americana é diferente do sistema brasileiro, né? Que a lei vai e fala aqui para todo mundo, né? E aí a gente discrimina. Lá não, lá vai entrando aos pouquinhos e tal, vai concedendo explicitamente, né? Essa distinção é explícita o tempo todo, né? Então, foi isso que eu comentei, né? Foi só um comentário e tal. Agora, eu vou fazer 2 perguntas. Eu vou fazer primeiro em português, depois eu faço. Eu quero que
Mas não quer dar um tempo para ele responder seus comentários ou não? Vai fazer direto a pergunta?
Well, she's giving you some time to answer my comments. I don't know if I didn't ask you anything. I was just,
right.
Talking about similarities that
right.
we have here,
right.
and also difference. Because
yes.
Here you have an idea, our legal system, that you make a law, and the law is for everybody. But then it's not so.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of people get discriminated, and you don't apply the law to that people. And then in the United States, it's different. The law is explicit, make explicit to whom it applies and to whom it does not apply, as you said in the case of natives.
I have a couple of responses to your comments. I was going to say something about the reference to criminals as barbarians. You mentioned that in Brazil. We have something like that here in the United States. This kind of survival of a strong current of racism as a way of denouncing and delegitimating, dehumanizing, essentially, criminals or people charged with crimes. However, here it is primarily directed against Black people. And that is partly because the Native presence in this country has been substantially erased. And I say erased because it is partly that there was very substantial physical extermination of the Native population. There were many, many, many Native peoples who were simply killed. But also, there has been a substantial assimilation of the Native population into, depending on the area, either our Black population or the people who are identified today as Latinos or Hispanic. So, if you were to do, genetic testing of either Black Americans or people who are identified as Black or people who are identified as Latino in this country, you'd find quite a bit of Native blood. But in terms of a social category, Native Americans have been substantially erased in most parts of the United States. So to the extent that there is a racist element that operates against, that is employed by political forces and by the police against so-called criminals, it's more directed against the Black population. And the term that you often hear people use today in American political discourse is thugs. These people are thugs. I don't know if you're familiar with this term, thug, T-H-U-G. It is a sort of a slang term for somebody who is inherently criminal. And this term has a definite racial connotation. We're talking, and it is used in, by the right wing in this country, primarily to refer to Black people. And it is, in our politics today, right? I mean, as we're going into these elections just a few weeks from now, crime with a racial element to it is a major factor. It's a major mobilizing factor for the right wing in the United States. On the slavery of Indians, here in California, Indians were enslaved in the mission system. You know, the Catholic mission system that I described in the in the talk, which was mostly focused in the coastal regions and up to just a little bit north of San Francisco. Native Americans were enslaved. They were the ones who built the missions. They were the ones who farmed the missions, and of course, all under the ostensible justification that they were being Catholicized. They were being brought into the faith, and they were being made full human beings by their contact with the missions. After the end of Spanish and then a brief 20 years of Mexican administration, as I said, California entered the United States in 1848 as a so-called free state. In other words, one in which slavery was not officially practiced. However, it continued to be practiced in reality. And the main means of that was a law that was passed in 1850 that enabled white people to essentially, enslave Indians if the Indians were indigent or vagrant, or if they were, if they committed any minor civil wrong, they could be taken into the custody of a white person, and they could be, they could essentially be enslaved. This was not called slavery. It was supposed to be based on, on the commission of some wrong, some minor wrong on the part of the native individual. But people were simply scooped up. Native Americans were simply scooped up and enslaved, sold. And a lot of this was, because the gold rush brought a lot of single men into the state, a substantial proportion of the population. So it was especially Indian women and Indian children who were being appropriated for their sexual services and for domestic labor. They were the housekeepers. They were the, they worked in agriculture and mining and other pursuits, but it was substantially Indian women and children who were abducted during this time period.
Thank you, George. I will translate
Sure.
in a very resumed way.
Yeah.
Então, a resposta do George foi fazendo essa análise, né, de que thug, essa análise de que nos Estados Unidos o tipo de colonização nos Estados Unidos ocasionou um extermínio em massa da população nativa indígena, né, diferente do que aconteceu no Brasil, não que aqui não tenha havido extermínio, houve, né, mas em uma outra medida, né, tanto que nos Estados Unidos essa maneira dessas políticas se expressarem de maneira racista fica muito mais evidente contra a população negra, e aí eles usam, né, inclusive os agentes de segurança pública, enfim, agentes públicos nos Estados Unidos utilizam esse termo thug, né, uma gíria racista para se referir a negros como marginais, né, nascidos como criminosos. Tem, né, o Tupac, né, aquele famoso rapper, usa esse termo, né, de uma maneira, uma tentativa de ressignificar e empoderar, né, de outra forma. Acho que as pessoas estão mais familiarizadas com isso. E ele fez um comentário muito interessante sobre essa escravidão dos índios, né, que quando a escravidão já era proibida nos Estados Unidos, em 1850 inventaram, né, como alternativas de se manter essa escravidão, de uma maneira legal, mas não sendo necessariamente uma escravidão. Seria para índios, né, os nativos que ainda sobraram na região e que tivessem sido condenados por pequenas contravenções penais, pequenos crimes, e ser escravizado, não era esse o nome, mas era o que acontecia, era como se fosse parte do cumprimento dessa pena, né, por eles terem cometido esses crimes, né, e a gente sabe muito bem, né, que não devem ter sido crimes como vadiagem, né, por exemplo, ou seja, apenas estratégias de implementação de políticas públicas e de leis para conseguir manter essa população ainda sobre práticas, né, escravocratas.
E também havia a escravidão de mulheres e crianças, né, no trabalho doméstico. E ele diz que isso muito porque na Corrida do Ouro, né, que ele já citou aí, do 1849, né, dos 49ers, né, de São Francisco, vieram muitos homens, né? Então as mulheres e as crianças eram apropriadas sexualmente e também domesticamente como escravos, né? Quer dizer, não eram escravos legalmente, mas eram, né, como se fosse a mesma coisa, né? E muito interessante isso. Bom, well, George, in this case of a native slavery, it was one of the questions I was going to ask you that you mentioned in your talk, and I became curious about it, and that now you just... So the other question I was going to address you was about what happens with the Hastings thing that you said that you could enter in more details, and I think not everybody here knows the
news about that.
Yeah, the news about that.
Sure. I would be happy to share that. So on September 23rd, in other words, just over a month ago, the governor of the state of California signed a law that had been passed through the California legislature, which changes the name of the college from UC Hastings College of the Law to UC College of the Law, San Francisco. So the name Hastings has been dropped. In addition to that, the law, this is in the law itself, there are 21 restorative justice measures, including that the library of the school will receive a Yuki name. In other words, a native name. And there are many other, as I said, there are 20 other restorative justice measures. They include providing free tuition to native Yuki students, if any attend the law school, providing legal advice and support for the creation of a nonprofit organization that will support the tribe, and of course many others. So in other words, the effort to change the name of the school has finally been successful. And I should say that this was an effort that went on for about 5 years, when the facts of Hastings' genocidal campaign against the Yuki was made broadly public for the first time. And the school strongly resisted the name change for quite a while. It's very, it's almost comical, to be frank with you. Almost exactly a year ago, I believe it was October 28th of last year, the New York Times published a front page long article exposing the facts of Hastings' crimes and exposing the school's inadequate response to it. And there were 1,200 comments to that article online, almost all of which were deeply, scathingly critical of the school. And the board of the college, which had just, just months before, well, about a year before, they had said, no, we're not going to change the name. In 1 week, less than a week, November 2nd, they had an emergency session and they voted unanimously to change the name. So it was the public embarrassment, essentially, of this article, which changed the dynamic in this direction. And again, years of trying to avoid the name change, and then once this all happened, it took less than a year for it actually to change. And of course, the name change had to go through the legislature because the name of the college itself had been established in the education code, so it required legislative action. So that's the story with the name change of Hastings.
Thank you, George. I will translate. Kant perguntou para ele, né, qual foi o desenrolar dessa história aí da mudança do nome da universidade na Califórnia, onde George é professor, que ele comentou, Kant comentou no início, antes da conferência, e o George falou nessa conferência que o Serenus Hastings, que é o cara que deu o nome dessa universidade, essa faculdade de Direito da Califórnia, né, em São Francisco, era um dono, né, começou a minerar os mineradores nessa corrida para o ouro na Califórnia, então foi um cara que lucrou a base da morte, né, e do extermínio, da exploração da população indígena de uma etnia chamada Yuki, e George, junto com outras pessoas da universidade e outros grupos remanescentes dessa população, enfim, se juntaram num trabalho aí legislativo e midiático, né, para demandar dentro da universidade e fora dela a mudança do nome da universidade, inclusive com uma proposta que infelizmente não foi aceita, né, de botar o nome da universidade com um nome nativo, que é Poenon, que significa One People na linguagem dos Yuki. Isso não foi aceito, né? Agora o nome da universidade ficou Universidade da Califórnia College of the Law, University of California College of the Law.
São Francisco.
Em São Francisco. Então tirou o Hastings, que era o sobrenome desse cara, né, como um reconhecimento de que ele não representava mais nada do que uma universidade de direito na Califórnia pretende, né, formar os seus colegas. Né?
E aí botaram o nome Yuki na biblioteca da universidade, e o que ele disse aí, que alguém está publicando aí artigos, né, e tal, porque o New York Times publicou um artigo de uma página, a primeira página, que teve 1.200 comentários, criticando o colegiado da universidade, do college, né, porque ele não concordava com essa mudança de nome. E que aí eles se reuniram extraordinariamente e aprovaram imediatamente, por unanimidade, essa mudança, né? Então, mostra que o poder da mídia, né? E do embaraço, né? Trazido pela exposição pública, né? Dessa reação, né? do colegiado da escola não querer mudar o nome, né? Então, foi a mídia, no final das contas, foi o New York Times que resolveu o problema, que é um sinal interessante do poder, né, da mídia tradicional, Unidos, né, dos Estados Unidos, né?
E bom, aí aqui no chat tem um artigo que foi escrito pelo professor George e um outro colega da universidade também, em que eles discutem um pouco essa situação. Então, quem tiver mais curiosidade de saber, é só jogar lá no Google a questão do nome, mas também pode ir por esse artigo que foi compartilhado pelo George com a gente em junho, se eu não me engano.
Isso aí.
Aí você vai fazer outra pergunta?
Não. I'm over.
So, George, we are over questions here. We would like to ask you if you want to make final comments or if you want to send a message to people who are listening to us, and I will happily translate for you.
Sure. So just two quick things. First of all, I did see a number of very nice comments flash up on the screen from various of my friends there. Nice to hear from you, and thank you very much for your compliments. I appreciate them all. I'm very excited. I'll just end by saying I'm very excited about this project on private violence in settler colonial states. And I'm especially pleased that you, Paloma, and perhaps others will be working on this topic too, because clearly what's going on in Brazil today, in the Amazon region at a very minimum, has strong parallels. And I mentioned to you, I think in one of our past conversations, that the slogan that was cited by the military government in Brazil at a time when it was promoting private settlement of the Amazon region, a land without people for a people without land. That was exactly to the word the slogan of the Zionist movement in the late 19th century as it was beginning to settle Palestine. Of course, in neither case was the land, in fact, without people. It is part of that racist perception that those who actually live there aren't people. They're not humans in the same sense that the rest of us are. And so, I think it's vitally important that we explore this phenomenon in a number of places. Brazil is surely not the only place this is going on in the world, nor is Palestine. And so I think exposing this phenomenon for what it is, exploring its commonalities and its differences is a very worthwhile project. And I appreciate the fact that we're going to be working on it together, and welcome the contributions of anybody else with interest in this topic. So thank you very much for allowing me to share these thoughts with you and this project with you. And I look forward to working with you and seeing more of you in the future.
Well, we say the same to you. The same to you. It will be a pleasure to work with you again. And I just would like to comment that, this thing happened in the United States in the 19th century, and we are in the 21st century. So 200 years later, we are living, the same slogan, that you mentioned, that a land without people to a people without land, because this is exactly what they think about it.
Yeah.
So we have a lot to work and a lot to do in this project. Thank you very much for inviting us to participate in it. Anyway.
Thank you, George. We are looking very forward to work and starting this project with you. I will translate here briefly for our audience, and then we can end the transmission. Thank you very much. Gente, então só traduzindo esse finalzinho da parte do George, como o Kant falou, a gente está iniciando agora um projeto com ele nos convidou para fazer essa pesquisa acerca dessa violência praticada por civis, que ele chama de uma violência privada, né, nesse tipo de colonização que ainda acontece em sociedades como específicas, né, essa situação específica que aconteceu na Califórnia no século XIX, que acontece com a Palestina e Israel agora, e o que acontece agora na Amazônia brasileira, né? Então, eu, Kant, a professora Eliane Cantarino, e quem mais se interessar e tiver curioso e, enfim, a fim de participar desse projeto de pesquisa que está se iniciando, né, Kant, para trabalhar essa questão dessa colonização ainda em andamento, né, na nossa região, no Brasil, enfim, explicitar, né, as pessoas envolvidas nesses processos e suas dinâmicas são muito bem-vindos. Ele fala muito desse lema que chama muita atenção dele, que é o lema que Israel utiliza para invadir a Palestina, que é um lema militar, né, de que é uma terra sem... uma terra sem gente para
pessoas sem terra.
Tem a tradução em português que eles falam aqui, o Exército Brasileiro usa, né? Inclusive, desde...
Usou no governo militar, naquele projeto, né? O projeto da Calha Norte, né? O projeto daquele outro negócio, né? Transamazônica, né? Aquilo tudo. Eles usavam o mesmo slogan, né? que
os militares
de Israel, né? E aqui eles usam o mesmo slogan, mas só que para fazer o que os Estados Unidos fizeram no século XIX, né? Que é isso que eu estou dizendo, que nós sempre assim um pouco
atrasados,
anacrônicos, não é isso? E tal, para variar, né? Tudo aqui vai embora, as coisas ruins vão embora mais tarde, né? Então, as coisas boas nem sempre.
Então é isso, gente. Queria agradecer muitíssimo a nossa audiência aí que se manteve firme e forte com a gente. Aproveitar para convidá-los para, né, manterem-se atentos aí às nossas atividades híbridas. Não hesitem em fazer perguntas, mandar e-mail para tirar dúvidas sobre em que lugar vai ser, se é híbrido, se é online, enfim. A gente vai continuar agora com as programações dos grupos de trabalho, hoje e amanhã vemos vocês de novo aqui no Valonguinho, ou então pelo YouTube, para a mesa de lançamento do livro da professora Lana Lage, às 17 horas. Agradeço a todas e todos, o pessoal das LIBRAS aí, o pessoal do nosso LEME, sempre muito parceiro e fazendo essa transmissão acontecer. E desde já pedimos desculpas, caso aconteça algum tipo aí de imprevisto, seja nas transmissões, seja presencial, um evento grande, né? Estamos sendo ousados aí nessa programação desse ano, fazer essa retomada presencial, mas muito felizes de a gente poder se encontrar. E agradecer aqui a parceria com o meu querido professor e orientador, supervisor Roberto Cante de Lima, sempre muito bom estar com você, é uma companhia sempre muito agradável que eu aprendo muito. Então, obrigada a todas e todos. Thank you, George. See you later. And bye-bye. Tchau, gente.